Well, as I was traveling here from Arizona last night, I recall the words of a former Democratic member of Congress from Illinois, who had been both a teacher and a lawyer. And he had a particular vision about the Department of Education. He said it would be a pure fountain from which a pure stream could flow all across the states. It would be a controlling head by which the conflicting systems in the different states can be harmonized, by which there can be uniformity. I take the high ground that every child is entitled to an education at the hands of somebody, and that this ought not be left to the caprice of individuals or the states as far as we have any power to regulate it. Does that sound familiar? Well, guess what? It's not who you think. This argument was actually made by Representative Samuel Moulton of Illinois 150 years ago, 1 year before the U.S. Department of Education was originally founded back in 1867. You don't see that on the billboards or the flyers from the U.S. Department of Education, do you? Well, as the title of my book suggests, I have a very different viewpoint about the supposed purity of the DC stream pouring out on the states like yours and mine, particularly Oklahoma, which is home to the Lindsay Nicole Henry Scholarships Program and also the Equal Opportunity Education Scholarship Program, which Arizona may have been the first out of the gate almost 20 years ago with tax credit scholarships. With some amendments, your tax scholarship program could be the biggest, the strongest, and the model to follow. So I always like to see what you all are doing with your tax credit scholarship. So thank you for your hard work in getting that advanced. But I was inspired to write this book as we are approaching the 30-year anniversary of the U.S. Department of Education. I went to school in the 70s and 80s, both public schools and private schools. And I was wondering, well, really, are we better off because of it? Well, spoiler alert, frankly, I don't think we are. And it's really striking that we're hearing so many increasing calls for the department's abolition this presidential election cycle. And I'm going back, to last year too. If you do a quick internet search for abolition in Department of Education, more and more people are really calling for it to just be done away with. So I think it's fair to say that we're in an era where an increasing number of us think it's time to just pull the plug on the Department of Education. But what does that really mean? If the department's history teaches us anything, it's like bureaucracies are not like fine wines. They do not improve with age. They just get bigger and they are more resilient. The U.S. Department of Education has been downgraded, defunded, and reshuffled throughout the federal agencies throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries. But rather than abolishing it during the 1980s, we decided to keep it around and try and use it to promote an excellence agenda. The result? Common Core, which, by the way, I just recently heard that some people are calling it Commode Core. I almost fell over laughing when I first heard that. Couldn't be more appropriate. Well, here we are in the Common Core era, and what we're living isn't what we were promised at all back in 1979. We'll recall that the U.S. Department of Education was supposed to do essentially three things. Number one, improve student achievement. Number two, supplement, not supplant, state efforts. And number three, and I always have a hard time keeping a straight face with this one, and number three, improve management and efficiency of federal education programs. Well, how'd those promises turn out? Let's turn to number one, improve student achievement. Achievement across subjects and grade levels on the nation's report card, as well as various international tests, have been essentially flat. As far as I can tell from the empirical track record, we are simply spending above average amounts for squarely average student performance. When it comes to top performing countries globally, we spend about a third more. Now, a U.S. Department of Education was also supposed to, number two, supplement, not supplant state and local governments. Our founding fathers never intended for the federal government to be a quote-unquote partner with the states in education, much less the boss. In fact, the word education doesn't appear once in our Constitution. But going along with this partnership has been a bad deal for students, schools, and taxpayers. During the No Child Left Behind era, for example, the Department of Education's paperwork burden increased by 65% and was larger than the paperwork burden imposed by the Departments of Defense, Energy, and Justice, just to name a few. In fact, the administrative burden is now so great, most employees at state education departments are hired just to deal with federal education programs. Today, in the Common Core era, states are spending an estimated $80 billion, according to a former U.S. Department of Education official. We'll recall that the entire Race to the Top grant program that we enacted through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009-2010, Race to the Top was $4.4 billion. So we in the states are spending 20 billion more than the entire, 20 times more than the entire program that was supposed to incentivize state reform efforts. Well, what about number 3? A U.S. Department of Education was supposed to improve management and efficiency of federal education programs. After 30 full years of operation, the Government Accountability Office, the government's official watchdog, found that the Education Department was one of a dozen or so agencies operating nearly 300 federal social training and education programs, and that no uniform definition of an education program even exists. But it gets even worse. According to the Office of Management and Budget, just 6% of Department of Education programs were deemed effective after 30 years in operation. So after more than 3 decades of a Department of Education, the educational performance of students has not improved in spite of massive spending increases. The department has not achieved the promised administrative efficiencies, reduced paperwork, or better management of federal education programs. So it's highly unlikely that more time, more fiddling with the org chart, or certainly funneling more money through this department is really going to improve education in the states. It's high time to reject the now commonplace notion that the federal government has some quote-unquote traditional or historical role in education. On the contrary, such notions have no constitutional basis, even if the U.S. Department of Education were getting the results it promised. There's no evidence that officials in the federal government, including those in the U.S. Department of Education, know best. Neither, for that matter, do state officials. The key difference for those of us who believe in constitutional federalism is that our state officials are closer to those of us who elect and hold them accountable. State citizens are best situated to keep them accountable, and actually work together to implement reforms that work for students and families in their local communities. In fact, as we're seeing today, not only is the U.S. Department of Education just a neutral, it's just, not really helping. It's actually becoming an increasing hindrance. I have here a letter dated December 22nd, 2015. This is a letter that was sent to every state school chief in the country. It was dated December 22nd, but it didn't arrive till early January. I call it the Happy New Year Nastygram from the U.S. Department of Education. This is available online, by the way. It's from Ann Whalen. You can just Google it and find it. It's right there. If you turn to page 2, this is what our hard-earned tax dollars are going towards, because we all know in this room that there's no such thing as a federal education dollar. Every dollar we send to DC is dollars that we have earned in our states, send there, and we get back maybe 10 cents on the dollar if we're lucky. So this is what our hard-earned tax dollars are going towards. This letter is full of helpful tips, threats, to our state superintendents of public instruction that if they don't threaten schools, and if schools don't in turn threaten parents to make sure at least 95% of children take Common Core influence tests, what's going to happen? Well, our caring and concerned U.S. Department of Education is threatened to withhold Title I funds, which, as we know, are funds earmarked for schools that overwhelmingly serve low-income and disadvantaged children. Oh, but it gets better. What you could also do is withhold school grades from schools that otherwise are doing very well by all other objective measures, and you could deem them in need of improvement. You could withhold all sorts of proficiency standards. That's our department, that's our partner at work for us, for kids. Thankfully, this summer, those laws have changed. So in case anyone tells you that states do not have, can't set policy about letting parents with legitimate concerns about Common Core influence tests, states are completely empowered to define 95% as they see fit. The states are completely empowered to make regulations and laws affecting how students, whether or not students are tested. So we have, normally I'm not speaking to as many lawmakers. This is what I tell constituents who attend, and listen to my remarks. Do not let your elected officials or your colleagues say or bamboozle you that you're going to lose money. Don't let AGs, I don't know how your Attorney General is, coming up with really crafty opinions of what your own Constitution says. We are empowered as it should be. So hopefully parents will not be threatened and schools won't be threatened this upcoming school year. So as we know, efforts to fix the U.S. Department of Education, to pass more effective legislation, to streamline operations, none of it has worked. There's only one remedy that's going to work, and that's a complete abolition of the U.S. Department of Education. Now, I won't go through all 122 programs administered by the department's 29 offices and subdivisions, 4,600 employees, but here's an overview of how we can eliminate the Department of Education, starting today if we wanted to, through what I call strategic dismantling. Strictly speaking, strategic dismantling doesn't eliminate a single education program right now. All it does is take all the education programs that are currently being administered through the U.S. Department of Education, and it gives it back to the states. The first thing we could do by just shuttering the U.S. Department of Education up, we could all get our share of some $14 billion in administrative, non-program personnel and overhead costs. That could go to the taxpayers on the next time taxes are due. How would you like to save more than $216 billion more, in addition to about $200 million in employee salaries? Take all those programs, give them back to the states. Here's a dirty little secret most state superintendents of public instruction aren't going to tell you on the record. If you get them off the record, up to 90% of everyone in your, I'm sorry, I don't know where your state education building is, simply work on federal mandates. They work on federal programs. I recently had a meeting, again off the record, with a superintendent at one of our state's largest public schools, more than 65,000 students. And he said, everyone in the floor, we're in a big building, everyone on the floor below us, federal compliance paperwork. That's all that floor does. He said, I'm at the point now where federal money is costing me too much. I don't want it anymore. Between the mandates and also with the accommodations regulations, the bathroom regulations. He's in the heart of a Mormon community. Guess what's going to happen if they put any sort of bathroom regulations? He's going to lose, basically, all of his students. So that's what they're facing right now. So do you see how easy that would be conceptually? One, we get our money back. And then two, all those programs simply go to the State Department of Education. Oh my goodness, but what would happen then? People get so worried. We already have the infrastructure in place. We already have the personnel in place. Practically speaking, any federal grant for any federal program lasts between 1 and 5 years, depending on the program. So basically, we just administer those programs with the states until they run out. We've already paid for them. So we just let them go until it runs out. And then if we think these programs are effective, we think we need them, we pay them directly through our state taxes. Guess what? It's one of my favorite senators on this subject said, Senator Barry Goldwater, he said, instead of sending it to Washington, D.C. minus the brokerage fee, every dollar, you know how we talk about every dollar goes to the classroom? Every dollar goes to the classroom if we get rid of the U.S. Department of Education. So conceptually, it is very, very easy to do. But one of the things people worry about is that what's going to happen to public schools, our traditional district public schools during this transition period. I would ask you to consider how things stand now. Under the prevailing system, federal funding doesn't last in perpetuity, and let's face it, when did a federal education funding for a federal education program ever cover the full cost? How many times do you hear from your superintendents or your school boards that we need to, this is an unfunded mandate? Well, in most cases, it's true. But there's a larger problem with the current partnership between the states and the federal government. Think about it. Every 8 years or so, as one administration assumes office in DC and another administration leaves, look at what's going on in schools. Think back to, here's an example. Think back to 1965, right before, before the U.S. Department of Education. War on Poverty, LBJ passed through the federal education program, Right to Read. By 1980, we're going to eliminate illiteracy. Do you know that by 1984, by 1984, the literacy rates among 17-year-olds were lower than before they started? Okay, well, what about the Bush 1 Clinton years? Goals 2000. By 2000, we're going to have high school graduation rates that exceed 90%, and we are once again going to be global leaders in math and science. Okay, we just this past year broke over 80% high school graduation rates, and those numbers, by the way, were highly suspect. I'd be careful of it. As for being global leaders, I hate to myth bust here, but the fact that the claim that American students were ever global leaders in math and science is a complete fiction. Never happened. We have always been squarely average. And what's happening now, the reason why, we're going down in the rankings, our performance has always stayed within a very narrow range of, we're about the average, that's it. What's happening now is more and more countries are participating in these assessments. So we are stalling. You know who's cleaning our clocks? Places like Vietnam, and we know the big ones, Finland, Singapore, China, certain, newer for us in these assessments, Asian countries. I would also watch out for certain more democratic Muslim countries. Very poor countries are coming in, they want to get this recognition. We're staying the same. So something to think about. So after all of these successes, we're going to do this. The most obvious one, No Child Left Behind. By 2014, 100% student proficiency, and here, there, and it. Now, listen, I'm not going to go through all the numbers. We weren't even close. But what's happening in our schools and in our communities right now? Well, let's think of it right now. Well, we just got No Child Left Behind in our annual yearly progress and all of this. All that infrastructure, we rejiggered our tests, we spent all of this money for new tests and assessment. Oop, never mind, throw that aside, because now we're going down the Common Core vein. You can have college and career ready standards. Everyone in this room knows that that's absolutely bogus, right? Okay, so I'll skip that part of the remarks. So do you see the upheaval? Just as a new administration takes office, we have to throw out what we just put in place and put in something new. You wonder why students aren't doing well? You wonder why really good people don't want to be teachers? It's not a mystery. But there are solutions. And one of the questions I'm asked most often is, well, Ronald Reagan, didn't he say he wanted to get rid of the Department of Education? Here's the critical difference between 1980 and today. Ronald Reagan was the one who, those of us who have ESA programs, tax credit scholarship programs, K-12 voucher programs, Ronald Reagan was really the one thinking about these ideas and advocating them. However, no state had implemented them yet. Flash forward to today, you and I have no excuse whatsoever. not to be expanding parental choice in education. That's why it's so nice for Arizonans, people like me, Arizonans and Oklahomans working together. We know better. We know that. So what are those choice programs? 61 choice programs in 30 states and DC. If you do not have a private parental choice program, you are now in the distinct minority of American states. I love to tell my friends, I was in California last week. It was so fun to rouse them about that because they think they're so cutting edge. Yes, cutting edge for buggy whip makers, I guess. We really do need to be expanding parental choice in education. So I'm not going to run through the numbers because this audience knows so much more than typical audiences. But you know the results. Children whose parents are empowered to pick not just where they go to school, but how they are educated thanks to education savings account programs. Let's face it, the research is clear. They have higher math scores, they have higher reading scores, higher high school graduation rates, and higher four-year college completion rates. DC did not build those programs. We citizens of the states did. And it's time to recognize that these programs are improving student achievement at levels we were told certainly would not be possible for certain types of students, and certainly not for the fraction that we're spending compared to what we're told we should be spending. More than 30 years after the creation of the U.S. Department of Education, students, taxpayers in the country aren't better off, but we can be. After decades of waiving the constitutional barrier to a federal role in education under the guise of partnering with the states, it is time to dissolve that partnership and abolish the U.S. Department of Education once and for all. Thank you so much.